After 2 decades, the US invasion of Afghanistan has ended, leaving behind an exorbitant cost to Afghan civilians and an uncertain future for the people of the country. More than 70,000 civilians killed, trillions of dollars spent, and months of to and fro in a fragile peace process only for the Taliban to take over the country within weeks. But who is the Taliban, and how did it capture the country? What led to the US invasion, and what has been Qatar's critical role in the past few years? 15th of August 2021. The Afghan flag is lowered as the Taliban declares victory over the 20-year foreign invasion of Afghanistan and the Afghan government forces. Months of fighting Afghan forces and swift territorial gains gives the Taliban unobstructed access to the presidential palace. With the fleeing of former President Ashraf Ghani, footage of Taliban fighters sitting at his desk sent shockwaves across the world.
The Taliban are now in complete control of Afghanistan.
Outside on the streets of Kabul, panic erupted and thousands of civilians scrambled towards the airport, desperate to escape. Horror ensued as some latched on to moving planes, with disturbing footage showing the moment in which at least 2 civilians fell to their death after takeoff. While some were desperate to escape the grips of the Taliban, others sought a way out of a country devastated by decades of war, corruption, and a lack of opportunities.
It's also not a matter of whether they're going to be killed or not, but I think there are many more that believe that Afghanistan wouldn't be a place they would like to live in.
In order to understand the country's current state, it's important to break down the group's history. And to do that, we need to go back some 40 years. On the 25th of December 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan following a power struggle between Afghan officials. The Soviets were seeking dominance over a fragile state with aims to install a puppet pro-Soviet regime. Afghan resistance fighters, known at the time as Mujahideen, emerged to fight off the Soviets. Keen on crushing its influence in yet another part of the world, the CIA launched a covert mission dubbed Operation Cyclone, supplying the Mujahideen with funding and weapons to fight off communist Russia. Many from around the region volunteered to fight the Soviets, including Osama bin Laden, who later became notoriously known as the founder of Al-Qaeda. US President at the time, Ronald Reagan, even described the Mujahideen as freedom fighters and even met with them at the White House in 1983. With an arsenal of weapons to fight the Soviets, the Kremlin backed out of Afghanistan on 15th of February 1989 after a 10-year occupation. Along with the withdrawal came the resignation of Soviet-supported Afghan leader Mohammad Najibullah in 1992, who was later put on house arrest. But it wasn't over just yet. The fall of the Soviet rule led to a 4-year bloody war between Mujahideen leaders, and by 1994, the Taliban emerged in Kandahar led by Mullah Muhammad Omar and his students. Omar made it his mission to establish a strict form of ruling based on his interpretation of Islam. This was used as a pretext to clear the country from corruption, and he even managed to persuade up to 15,000 religious students from Afghanistan and Pakistan to join the group. By 1996, 50,000 people were killed during a brutal civil war. By September of the same year, the Taliban captured Kabul and publicly executed former President Najibullah. The following year, his brother met the same fate, and the group declared Afghanistan an Islamic emirate. The militants exposed strict laws that prevented women from working, attending schools, and even banned women from going out without a male guardian. It's this era in which images of Afghan women in blue burqas were plastered across much of the Western world.
When they were in power, they believed that any depiction of a living thing, like anything that would breathe, that would include also animal, was prohibited. So there was no TV, there was obviously no smartphone, no photos, and no one was allowed to even have like a photo ID.
On September 11, 2001, tragedy struck the United States. Washington demanded that Al-Qaeda chief bin Laden surrenders, and he was believed to be the architect of the attacks. Meanwhile, Taliban leader Mullah Omar refused to hand over bin Laden and demanded proof of his involvement. Then President George W. Bush to quickly mobilize a response that would see American troops engage in a decades-long war in Afghanistan that would kill thousands of civilians. Within months, US and NATO troops forced the Taliban out of Kabul, leaving the group with no choice but to retreat home to Kandahar. On the 5th of December of the same year, the Bonn Agreement was signed by anti-Taliban factions and political groups. While the agreement was thought to pave the way for the establishment of peace and security in Afghanistan, it only gave Western powers the leeway to invade the country for 20 years. Hamid Karzai was appointed as a transitional president, and with that, the Taliban rule had come to an end. By 2011, Osama bin Laden was killed in a covert US operation launched by President Barack Obama, ironically in Pakistan and not Afghanistan, despite claims of him being accused of hiding in the latter. Despite this, the war in Afghanistan continued and troops remained on the ground. Between 2015 and 2018, violent escalation between several factions allowed the Taliban to gain control of almost 40% of the country. Weary of impeding bloodshed, Qatar stepped in as a mediator between warring parties in late 2019. The Gulf state is a key US ally in the region and even hosts America's largest base in the Middle East, where 10,000 troops are stationed. Under Washington's request, Doha has hosted a Taliban political office since 2013 and has established relations with the group at the request of Washington. While the move was questioned at the time, it has now shown major results. Finally, in February 2020, the Taliban and its long-term enemy, the US, met face-to-face in Doha, where the two signed a historic agreement. Under the deal, Washington would withdraw all American and NATO troops by May 1st, 2021, on the condition that the insurgent group blocks terrorist organizations from using Afghan soil as a battlefield. In turn, the Afghan government would also release hundreds of Taliban prisoners. In September of the same year, Qatar hosted the intra-Afghan talks attended by world powers, Afghan government members, and the Taliban. The meetings were seen as a major signal of hope, simply for bringing all these actors together under one roof and at one table. However, grievances run deep, and as violence erupted once more in Afghanistan, talks at the negotiating table began to stall. Notable escalations first emerged in April this year, when President Biden announced a decision to end America's longest war by completely withdrawing US and NATO forces at a later date, the 11th of September. The iconic date would mark exactly 20 years since the declaration of war. News of the withdrawal inspired the Taliban to carry out attacks in Afghanistan, and pretty soon, educators, high-profile women, and journalists were targeted. The militants also started capturing control of areas in the country. Then, in the middle of the night on July 2nd, the US withdrew from the Bagram Air Base without prior notice, leaving 5,000 Taliban inmates unsupervised. The pullout from the base, the headquarters for the US military operations in the country, meant American-trained Afghan forces were left abandoned to fight against the Taliban. Despite Washington's $80 billion investment and years of training the local force, it failed to push back the militants. From then on, the Taliban offensive rapidly expanded, with militants taking control of the first provincial capitals, Zaranj, followed by Shaburgan, Saripul, and Taluqan. Within a week, Kandahar, Herat, Puli Alam, and Jalalabad had fallen, even as talks continued in Doha. And on the 15th of August, the heart of Afghanistan, Kabul, was captured without a fight. As leaders scrambled to work on a smooth power transfer, former President Ashraf Ghani fled to Tajikistan before then moving on to the UAE with what reports say was tons of stolen cash. News of the capture sparked panic in Kabul, and Afghans who previously worked with the US troops and foreign nationals quickly flocked to the airport in a desperate attempt to flee. At this point, Qatar took on a pivotal role to facilitate the safe transfer of Afghans and foreigners seeking evacuation. Its strategic rapport with the Taliban, as well as its long-standing relations with the US and other Western countries, allowed Doha to navigate on the ground in Kabul to ensure all evacuees reached the airport with no issues. The Qatar-led operation saved thousands of lives. Meanwhile, officials in Doha continued hosting talks between the Afghan government and the Taliban to push for a peaceful transition of power and an inclusive political solution. The Qatari capital became a center point for world leaders who sent foreign ministers to hold press conferences and talks with officials. Some countries, including the US, UK, Japan, the Netherlands, and Italy, even moved their missions from Kabul to Qatar to continue diplomatic efforts. This all happens as Taliban leaders in Kabul held press conferences to quell concerns of impeding violence and retribution. The insurgents said women would be allowed to work and gain access to education under Islamic law, and even claimed general amnesty for government officials and those who worked with foreign troops. Despite the promises, some reports of violence have surfaced. Journalists said they were beaten by Taliban members, protests were met with a swift crackdown, and UN documents revealed how the militants were conducting door-to-door raids to search for critics on the group alleged hit list. However, Taliban then claimed the reported attacks were conducted by people who tried to give the group a bad name. So far, the Taliban have appeared to spew all the right rhetoric to global media, though events on the ground remain vague. Until now, the future of the country remains unclear, with the need for humanitarian aid expected to rise as foreign countries become more hesitant to provide Afghans with aid due to the new Taliban government. The latest developments only contributed to the worsening situation in a country ridden by decades of war and corruption. With the pace of the developments in Kabul and mixed messages delivered by the Taliban, Afghans are left behind with the question of what's next for Afghanistan. And that wraps the end of episode 3 of In Depth. For more video content like this and analysis of Afghanistan, make sure you head over to our YouTube channel where we spoke exclusively to Lolo al-Khatir, the Taliban and Afghan refugees.